Before sunrise on a cold December morning in 1978, a quiet, heavily secured terminal at JFK Airport was about to become the center of one of the largest cash robberies in American history. There was no barrage of gunfire echoing through the streets. There were no alarms blaring across the city boroughs. Yet, inside a reinforced vault, millions of dollars in untraceable currency were waiting to completely disappear. Welcome to Lou's True Crime. I'm Lou. Tonight, we begin the story of the Lufthansa heist. It was a crime so bold, so meticulously calculated, and so ruthlessly covered up that it would shake the foundations of organized crime families and completely alter the landscape of law enforcement alike. Let's get into this deep dive. Part 1. The city, the airport, and the inside man. To understand how this happened, you have to understand New York City in the late 1970s. The city was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Crime was rampant, and the five families of the New York Mafia held a suffocating grip on dozens of legitimate industries. John F. Kennedy International Airport was more than just a transportation hub. It was a global artery of commerce, moving millions in currency, jewels, and valuables across borders every single week. But to the mob, JFK was something else entirely. It was a playground. It was their personal ATM. Among the most lucrative targets at the airport was the Lufthansa cargo terminal. This was a critical waypoint where international cash shipments, often from American military personnel and business operations stationed overseas in West Germany, were temporarily stored before being redistributed to banks across the United States. Security existed, of course, but it was largely theatrical. It depended heavily on routine, complacency, and the assumption that no one would be crazy enough to hit a fortified vault in the middle of a massive international airport. The key to unlocking this fortress was not a masked gunman kicking down a door, nor was it a hardened mob boss sketching plans in a smoke-filled room. The key was a man named Louis Werner. Werner was a 46-year-old employee who worked inside the Lufthansa cargo building. He had access, he had intimate knowledge of the facility, and perhaps most importantly, he had a crippling weakness: debt. Debt has always been fertile ground for recruitment in the criminal underworld. Werner was a compulsive gambler, and his luck was consistently terrible. He owed roughly $20,000 to bookmakers connected to the Lucchese crime family, specifically to a man named Martin Krugman, who ran a Queens wig shop that doubled as a mob front. As the pressure from the mob mounted quietly but menacingly, Werner realized he had only one way to save his own life. In organized crime circles, debts are not forgiven, but they can be leveraged. Werner held something far more valuable than the 20 grand he owed. He held information. Werner sat down with his mob contacts and began to sing. He revealed critical, highly sensitive details: the exact delivery schedules of the West German cash drops, the intricate vault procedures, the employee shift routines, and the glaring blind spots in the security habits. He described how overnight staffing was minimal and how the alarms could be bypassed if you knew the right people. It wasn't guesswork anymore. Werner had handed the mafia blueprint-level intelligence for the score of a lifetime. Part 2. Assembling the crew. This golden ticket of information worked its way up the chain of command, from the bookie Martin Krugman, to mob associate Henry Hill, and finally to the desk of Jimmy the Gent Burke. Jimmy Burke was a terrifyingly powerful associate within the Lucchese crime family. Because of his Irish heritage, Burke could never become a made man in the Italian mafia, but he commanded more respect and instilled more fear than almost anyone else in the syndicate. Burke was known for his strategic, calculating mind, his appetite for massive, high-risk operations, and a ruthless streak that made him a legend on the streets. He understood that success in organized crime required absolute precision, not chaotic violence. And the Lufthansa opportunity was the definition of precise. Burke began assembling a crew. He needed trusted associates with extensive experience in hijackings, extortion, and airport cargo theft. These could not be reckless amateurs. They needed to be men accustomed to strict discipline and the code of silence. The roster included some of the most notorious figures in the New York underworld. There was Tommy DeSimone, a violently unpredictable enforcer who was terrifyingly quick to pull a trigger. There was Joe Buddha Manry and Robert Frenchie McMahon, both of whom had extensive, intimate knowledge of the airport's inner workings. And then there was Parnell Stacks Edwards, a blues musician and criminal associate who was brought in for one specific, crucial job: the getaway and the disposal of the primary vehicle. Planning stretched across several agonizingly tense weeks. Surveillance was conducted quietly from the perimeter of the airport. Routines were confirmed and reconfirmed by Werner on the inside. Entry and exit timing was rehearsed mentally and physically until it became muscle memory for the crew. Burke laid down strict ground rules for the operation. There would be no unnecessary violence. Dead bodies brought federal heat, and Burke wanted this to look like a clean, professional ghost job. By early December 1978, the trap was set. The target date aligned perfectly with a particularly massive cash shipment arriving on a weekend. Werner confirmed that over $5 million in untraceable, small-denomination U.S. currency, along with nearly $1 million in rare jewelry, was sitting in the vault. For its time, it was an astronomical, life-changing sum of money. All that remained was the execution. On December 11th, just before dawn, the crew made their move. Part 3, the night of the robbery. Just before 3 a.m. on December 11th, 1978, the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport appeared calm, mundane, and perfectly routine. Employees worked their overnight shifts processing freight and filling out manifests, completely unaware that they were about to become unwilling participants in American history. Outside, the winter air hung heavy, freezing, and quiet, the absolute perfect conditions for a highly controlled tactical operation. Inside, the millions of dollars sat secured, layered behind bureaucratic procedure rather than true physical fortification. At 3:12 a.m., a black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the cargo terminal's loading dock. The robbery crew slid out of the vehicle with absolute precision timing. They were dressed deliberately to blend in, wearing dark clothes, ski masks, and gloves. Their movements were calm, purposeful, and heavily rehearsed. There was no frantic rushing, only the terrifying confidence built from weeks of preparation. The first obstacle was an outbound cargo agent named Kerry Whalen. As Whalen approached the van to investigate, he was immediately struck across the face with the butt of a .45 caliber pistol. The crew dragged the bleeding man inside, issuing a chilling instruction: "Don't look at my face. If you look at me, I'll kill you." This would be the only physical violence of the entire night. From that moment on, the message to the staff was clear: comply, and you will live to see the sunrise. Using the detailed floor plans provided by Louis Werner, the heavily armed crew bypassed the expected obstacles with shocking ease. They moved through the corridors, efficiently subduing the rest of the overnight employees. The staff members were gathered into a single break room area and restrained. To ensure absolute compliance, the robbers collected the employees' wallets and driver's licenses. They read the home addresses aloud. "We know where your families live," they warned. "If anyone hits an alarm, we'll visit your house." It was a psychological masterstroke. Control, not chaos, remained the guiding principle of the night. One member of the crew, accompanied by the terrified shift manager, moved directly toward the main vault. Because the codes, procedures, and internal timing had already been studied extensively, there was no fumbling. The manager, knowing his family was implicitly threatened, unlocked the double doors. When the heavy vault swung open, the sheer scale of the prize became visible. Sitting on the concrete floor were 40 neatly stacked cardboard parcels. Inside those parcels were stacks of untraceable currency, alongside smaller lockboxes containing precious gems and jewelry waiting for international transfer. The robbers worked methodically. A human chain was formed, passing the heavy cartons from the vault, down the hallway, and directly into the back of the waiting Ford Econoline van. Efficiency completely replaced excitement. It was pure, clinical discipline over adrenaline. Within roughly 60 to 90 minutes, the job was complete. Approximately $6 million in cash and valuables had been secured into the van. To put that into perspective, adjusted for inflation, that haul is worth over $26 million today. Before leaving, the crew ordered the employees to stay locked in the break room for at least 15 minutes, warning them again about the home addresses. The crew then slipped out into the freezing New York night, exiting with the same quiet, terrifying coordination they had entered with. By the time the first trembling employee finally called the Port Authority police at 4:30 a.m., the robbers were long gone, swallowed up by the vast urban landscape of Brooklyn and Queens. What seemed like an ordinary overnight shift had just become the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. The heist was practically flawless. Ironically, though, the robbery itself would not destroy the crew. It was the aftermath that would doom them all. Part 4: The Fatal Mistake and the Bloodbath. The entire getaway plan relied on careful staging and compartmentalization. Once the crew left the airport, they drove to a prearranged garage in Canarsie, Brooklyn. There, the millions of dollars were quickly transferred from the black Ford Econoline van into a switch car. Jimmy Burke took possession of the money, and the crew dispersed to establish their alibis. But there was one final, critical step to ensure they got away with it. The black van, which was essentially a rolling crime scene, needed to be destroyed. This job was given to Pernell Stax Edwards. His singular task was to drive the van to a mob-connected junkyard in New Jersey and have it crushed into an unrecognizable cube of scrap metal. Instead, Edwards made what is arguably the most infamous and fatal mistake in the history of organized crime. Rather than driving to New Jersey, Edwards decided to get high. He drove the van to his girlfriend's apartment building in Brooklyn, parked it illegally directly in front of a fire hydrant, and went inside to sleep. He left the van sitting there for 2 full days. When the NYPD finally noticed the illegally parked vehicle and impounded it, they hit the jackpot. Inside the van, investigators found muddy footprints matching the unique tread of the shoes worn by the robbers at JFK. More damningly, they found Stax Edwards' fingerprints completely covering the steering wheel. The FBI and Port Authority police now had a massive, glaring thread to pull. News of the robbery had already broken, dominating national headlines. Investigators, realizing the scale and precision of the crime, immediately knew they were facing a highly sophisticated organized crime syndicate. When they matched the fingerprints to Edwards, they instantly connected the van to Jimmy Burke's orbit. As the FBI began to swarm, issuing subpoenas and tapping phones, Jimmy Burke's demeanor shifted from triumphant to deeply paranoid. He understood that sudden wealth attracts attention, and federal pressure inevitably turns loyal criminals into desperate informants. Burke had issued a strict directive to his crew: act normal. Do not spend a dime. Do not buy flashy cars. Do not buy jewelry. And do not draw attention to yourselves until the heat dies down. But discipline is incredibly difficult when millions of dollars are suddenly within reach. Within weeks, members of the crew began ignoring Burke's orders. One associate bought a custom pink Cadillac. Another bought his wife a floor-length mink coat. Martin Krugman, the bookie, began loudly and aggressively demanding his cut of the score. To Burke, this flashiness and loud behavior wasn't just annoying. It was an existential threat. He realized that the only way to protect himself, and the only way to keep the entirety of the $6 million, was to completely clean house. What followed was a ruthless, systematic bloodbath that remains horrifying to this day. Stax Edwards was the first to pay the price for his mistake. Just days after the van was discovered, Tommy DeSimone visited Edwards' apartment and shot him 6 times in the head, silencing the FBI's strongest lead. But Burke was just getting started. Over the next several months, a dark cloud of death settled over the Lucchese family associates. Marty Krugman, the loudmouth bookie, vanished without a trace, his body presumably dismembered. Joe Buddha, Manry, and Robert Frenchie McMahon, the men who helped plan the logistics, were found dead inside a locked car in Brooklyn, both executed with a gunshot to the back of the head. Even the terrifying Tommy DeSimone, whose violent temper made him a liability, disappeared, murdered by a rival family with Burke's tacit approval. Trust, which had been the foundation of the planning phase, dissolved into absolute terror. Friends turned on friends. Every knock on the door, every requested meeting at a diner, felt like a potential execution. Jimmy Burke's version of damage control was leaving a trail of bodies across the 5 boroughs. The perfect heist had transformed into a slaughter. Part 5: Legacy, Consequences, and the Myth That Remains. As weeks turned into years, the Lufthansa heist transitioned from an active, frantic investigation into a piece of American criminal mythology. The sheer body count left behind by Jimmy Burke's paranoia meant that the FBI was left with very few living witnesses to prosecute. The authorities understood that organized crime cases rarely collapse overnight. They erode slowly under sustained pressure. The FBI launched a massive surveillance operation, cultivating informants and mapping out the financial irregularities of the surviving mobsters. Ironically, the only person to ever face serious jail time for the actual robbery itself was the man who started it all, the inside man, Louis Werner. Werner's gambling debts and erratic behavior made him an easy target for investigators. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, taking the fall while the men who orchestrated the violence slipped through the cracks of the specific heist charges. As for the $6 million, law enforcement never recovered the vast majority of the stolen cash and jewels. It is widely believed that Jimmy Burke kept nearly all of the money, laundering it through legitimate businesses and burying the rest. That immense absence of the money fueled public fascination just as much as the robbery itself. Sometimes, what completely disappears becomes infinitely more powerful than what remains. While investigators struggled to pin the heist directly on Burke, the intense scrutiny from the robbery eventually fractured his criminal empire. He was later convicted of a massive sports point-shaving scandal and the murder of a drug dealer, ensuring he died behind bars in 1996. Justice, in this case, moved incrementally and indirectly. The Lufthansa heist left a permanent mark on the world. It forced a massive overhaul of how airports and cargo facilities handled security worldwide. Procedures became drastically stricter, surveillance technology became highly sophisticated, and background checks for employees were suddenly mandatory. Criminal innovation, in this case, had forcefully demanded institutional adaptation. Security always evolves most rapidly right after a glaring vulnerability is exposed. Today, public fascination with the crime has never faded. It has been explored in countless books, documentaries, and most famously, immortalized in Martin Scorsese's cinematic masterpiece, Goodfellas. The robbery's incredible narrative arc, the precision of the planning, the massive scale of the prize, and the horrific mystery of the aftermath continues to capture imaginations across generations. Reality has seamlessly blended into mythology. For organized crime itself, the heist represented both an ultimate triumph and a dire warning. The enormous payout demonstrated exactly what was possible when a crew operates with military precision. Yet, the prolonged investigation and the staggering body count revealed how high visibility eventually, and inevitably, attracts lethal consequences. The Lufthansa heist symbolizes a very specific, bygone era of organized crime, one defined by calculated risk, immense payouts, and a total disregard for human life. That era has changed, heavily fractured by modern law enforcement tactics, but its dark influence persists. The echoes of that cold December morning in 1978 continue to resonate long after the money vanished. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the Lufthansa heist here on Lou's True Crime. These stories are not just about the mechanics of a crime. They're about a society in flux, the severe consequences of greed, and the people whose lives are permanently altered along the way. Your time, attention, and curiosity help keep these conversations thoughtful, analytical, and respectful. Stay aware, stay compassionate, and thank you for joining us. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos like these.